Hello, welcome to Pixel Life Gaming. In this video we will be looking at the prologue campaign Storm of Steel featured in the War Stories section of Battlefield 1. We will be analysing the campaign and its mission, searching for any historically accurate or inaccurate content. We will then compare these findings with any real-world scenarios and events that occurred during the mission settings, but before we begin, let's have a quick overview of the campaign mission that will feature in this video. The Storm of Steel prologue campaign features a single mission titled Break of Dawn, which introduces the player to the types of combat scenarios they will experience during the War Stories campaigns of Battlefield 1. The opening cinematic demonstrates the desperate, chaotic nature of combat during the First World War before allowing the player to experience this type of fighting firsthand through the campaign mission's gameplay. The first two sections introduce the player to infantry defensive combat as they must defend against several waves of German soldiers, before being transported to the gunner position of a World War I tank as it advances to attack the enemy defensive line. The final sections of the mission see the player take part in a counterattack against the German fortifications signalled by a whistle. The mission ends with a final cinematic that hints at the type of tactics used during the war and the scenarios that the player will experience during the other missions of the War Stories campaigns. Now we've had a look at the campaign's mission, let's analyse the historically accurate content within. When it comes to the historical elements within the mission, the most obvious aspect that shines through is the sheer brutality and desperation that was experienced by those caught up in the conflict. This desperation is present throughout the mission and its opening cinematic, with the soldiers within fighting each other with anything they can, from their rifles and pistols to shovels and rocks. This clearly demonstrates the sheer ferocity of the fighting and how desperate each soldier's situation is that they had to resort to using anything around them to continue the struggle and fight for their own survival. What makes this scene of the cinematic even more chilling is the look of terror on the main character's face as he is utterly helpless to act as the brutal scene unfolds around him. As well as this, the song playing in the background, Dream a Little Dream of Me, only enhances the sense of terror and dread present within the scene, as its slow melody and lyrics are in direct contrast to the type of imagery on display.
While I'm alone, blue as can be.
As the cinematic transitions to the mission's gameplay, we are given one final reminder of the desperation that was felt during the conflict before experiencing it for ourselves firsthand. This is achieved with a piece of text explaining what follows is frontline combat. You are not expected to survive. This segment prepares the player for the gameplay that will follow, with each of the player's characters eventually meeting a brutal death to progress the mission along. Not only does this element indicate the true brutality of the war and the desperate fighting that occurred, it also gives a slight idea of the true cost of the conflict, with many lives being lost on a single battlefield and the various ways in which they were killed. To aid in demonstrating the cost of war, the mission also features names for each individual character that is killed during the sequence, with some even being referred to as Unknown Soldier of the Great War. The inclusion of these names easily adds a very human element to the stories present within the mission, implying that they could have easily been real people with real lives and loved ones back home awaiting their return. By also including the concept of an unknown soldier, the game covers the ability to honour those individuals that lost their lives in the conflict but were never officially identified or found. Even though these events occurred over 100 years ago, each year there is often a grim reminder of the conflict on the former battlefields of the First World War, with discoveries and excavations of the bodies of missing soldiers on both sides of the conflict. The gameplay also features many historical aspects during the mission, ranging from the appearance of the battlefield, reflecting those of the war, to the weapons and technology developed during the conflict. The battlefield of the mission is covered with craters from artillery shells and flooded with mud and water, greatly resembling the imagery associated with many of the war-torn battlefields of the First World War, such as Flanders Field and Passchendaele. These battlefields were littered with destroyed buildings and rubble, and trees resembling telegraph poles from having their branches blown off by artillery shells. The appearances of these battlefields were far from the peaceful, flourishing states they were in before the war, now closely resembling the barren, cratered landscape of the moon. Also noticeable is the placement of decking boards on the battlefield, which were used to assist in troop movements to and from the front lines over the artillery-scarred land. Alongside these images of battle-worn landscapes, another historical element included are the newly developed weapons and technology created during the conflict. The First World War saw the first use of numerous weapons and strategies associated with modern warfare, such as aircraft and armoured vehicles, including the tank. These technologies range from infantry weapons, including submachine guns and flamethrowers, to chemical gas artillery shells. Although this is the case, there is also the inclusion of several weapons that never entered service during the conflict, such as the MP-18, which entered military service in 1918 after the war ended. However, this aspect can be easily overlooked as it adds greater diversity to the game, allowing for a more varied gameplay experience. One final, more subtle accuracy found in the mission is the use of sound cues, such as a whistle signalling an attack, a tactic used by both sides of the conflict. This ultimately had a psychological effect on the soldiers, with many becoming fearful of the sound, which they often came to associate with death and destruction. The final segment of the mission, the outro cinematic, greatly reflects the true cost of war, using emotion to convey the true feelings of the soldiers forced to fight during this conflict. This is most obvious when the main character of the opening cinematic and an enemy soldier, visibly horrified and distraught, refuse to shoot each other in an attempt to retain any semblance of humanity in a desperate situation. As well as this moment, there is a direct reference to the types of tactics devised during trench warfare, which have become synonymous with the fighting of the First World War. This comes in the form of the character's voice explaining,
"They push, we push."
This phrase reinforced the notion that the fighting is desperate for both sides and that the situation is hopeless, as is commonly associated with wars of attrition. Although this is the case, the mood is lightened at the end of the cinematic, transferring the nature of the war to one of hope that it will eventually come to an end.
Every once in a while, we push hard enough that the light breaks through the clouds, and a world beyond the war glimmers, just out of reach.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed everything that was discussed in this video, and if you did, please feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or check out some other playlists and videos on our channel. Until the next time, goodbye.